From afar, Devil May Cry has always seemed very weird to me. There's a lot of factors that play into this. The music, the visuals, and its reliance on its own unique style meter are all things that came off as unique, but strange nonetheless. I think the strangest and most interesting thing about the franchise, however, is Dante. In most action games, it is usually your goal to make the main character seem like a proper badass, and Devil May Cry understands this, with both the games and fans treating Dante in this manner. They really play into the idea of Dante being this badass guy who will pulverize any demon he finds unworthy of life. Then you look at his face and all those comments seem to just melt away. Dante is very pretty, to the point of distraction. His status of being one of the most iconic badass figures in action games is much harder to understand when you realize just how pretty he really is. Considering his role, it's a very contradictory choice that always stuck out to me. All those comments, cutscenes, and dialogues in all these games that try to push Dante up to the status of badass never works, since all those things just get washed away by the pretty tide of Dante's pretty face. God of War and Metal Gear are probably my favorite examples of badass characters in terms of visuals, and is usually what I find myself comparing Dante to. Snake has this gruff, slightly macho exterior to him, giving all his acts of badassery a slightly higher sense of realism to it. Not only that, but the way he speaks exuberates the type of charisma that you would expect out of someone given the title of a badass. He gives off an ethereal level of self-confidence that he probably doesn't even realize just how much of a badass he actually ends up being. This is especially clear whenever he's dealing with a threat. Snake composes himself in a way that shows the offender that he's experienced and knows how to handle a dangerous situation. Just looking at him, it's clear that he's capable of real damage, and sort of flaunts it outwardly in a sort of attempt to scare away the offender. It's also clear, however, that he doesn't undermine the offender's threat and will take them completely seriously. The line between life and death Snake rides is very clear, and he makes sure to handle every situation with the complete respect and caution they deserve. Kratos holds a lot of similar effects when it comes to voice and face, one of the most iconic things about Kratos being his face. Kratos holds one of the strongest frowns I've ever come across in anything, and it really sells his power to the viewer. Just from his face alone, you can tell he's extremely strong, but even more, he's comically angry, the anger being the main driver of his strength. His voice completely sells his idea of rage-driven strength, since he's just so loud and abrasive all the time. Of course, Kratos is not just strong and angry, with the game really showing off the quieter, more emotional side of him very often. You're shown very clearly that Kratos isn't just some guy with anger issues, but a man that has been molded by an evil society and evil men to become a truly monstrous killing machine. Snake is badass, but he's so badass to the point of his existence really becoming fiction. Kratos, in comparison, feels human. However, his badass half is so over the top to the point of still not feeling realistic. Which is the point, of course, of the badass archetype. It's one meant of imagination. His emotional side, however, does a great job of making him feel human, even when he's doing something truly horrific. Like any human, he makes mistakes, some drastically more unforgivable than most, but most being mistakes a human would make nonetheless. Then we look at Dante, another character that from the outside looking in feels like he's supposed to give off the badass impression a character like Snake gives you. Someone so cool and perfect that you can't really help but admire them. So whenever you do get any real knowledge of the character, it becomes more disappointing. Dante is a quiet boy. I call him a boy since that's the impression he gives off in those early games, but it's a trait that eventually goes away. Whenever he speaks, he does speak with confidence, but not in the same way a badass would, but similar to the way the goth kid in your school speaking about his unique hobbies would to the people that are weirded out by it. I said earlier that Snake speaks in a way that you would expect out of a badass, and I said that with the idea that badasses have a very unique way they speak. Books, movies, shows, and games all have this pretty universally recognizable way to show off that someone is badass, and that's with their voice. Low-pitched, slow-talking, witty speak makes up a pretty large amount of these characters' dialogue, so Dante being a higher-pitched, fast, Joker-type speaker makes it much harder to be sold on this idea. Dante is quiet, a pretty boy, and worse yet, he's a crybaby. He's also the most human out of all three characters, but ends up feeling the least like a badass in comparison. I just can't see Dante as a badass the way everyone says he is. The same way I can't seem to figure out what DMC5 is trying to go for. It's a game that wishes to play two separate sides of a coin that are so different that it leads to the entire game being a confused mess. When you look at the cutscenes, it's split between fun and serious moments, but to an unfun degree. You'll go from seeing some of the most over-the-top action that video games have to offer, with music, cinematography, and choreography all firing at 2,000,000%, to display the most ridiculous thing you've ever seen on screen. To a serious exchange about a threat you barely understand, with the latter taking up a surprisingly large amount of screen time. When it comes to gameplay, both Nero and Dante are extremely fun, complex characters, with each requiring completely unique skills to master them. The devs have been able to make two completely unique characters, both working under the same combat system while still making them feel wholly unique. A feat that should be applauded, and one that I would like to see further developed by other devs. However, the actual campaign is so easy that it begins to make you wonder why they went so deep in making such intricate characters. The game suffers from a strong sense of whiplash with how it's designed its campaign and characters that it can only be described as confusing. Challenge is an issue that never improves, with the game not allowing separate new saves on high difficulties. Even if it did, the higher difficulties are so lacking that it still wouldn't solve the issue. One save slot is offered to the players, with those wishing to start a fresh save being prompted to go into the file browser to delete or remove their save. Level design is extremely linear, with most levels being filled with hallways and arenas. One of the most important aspects of action games is pace breakers, to allow for less repetition to set in. Focusing so much on combat can lead to a heightened sense of repetition, so having pace breakers to rely upon when things get really exhausting is very important. Due to a lack of difficulty in linear level design, DMC5 just ends up becoming a mindless button masher. A tragedy, considering the game has an enemy variety, player kit, and progression systems to create an engaging and challenging campaign experience. DMC5 is not a good game. In fact, it's a pretty bad game. But it's a game that I can't help but find myself interested in. It's a game so lost in what it's trying to do while having so many others to look toward for advice. A game built upon a 20-year-long legacy of action games that feels like it wanted to try to be good without looking to the past, but ends up making me upset considering how much better the game would be if it did. My time with DMC5 has been some of the worst time I've spent playing video games. Confusion, frustration, and boredom ran through my mind throughout most of my time with it. DMC5 is a mindless button masher, with its endgame only marginally improving this fact. It's a game with a lot of entertaining elements and a campaign that serves more as a sandbox. If that sounds appealing to you, then I would recommend DMC5. With the 3 difficulties, Virgil Campaign, and Bloody Palace, you're looking at a minimum of around 30 hours. Keep an eye out for sales, since the game gets extremely high price cuts, making the value only that much higher. However, the game is so easy and repetitive that anyone else wondering if they should play the game or not, my response is no. I would tell anyone considering it to stay away from DMC5. Here's a list of action games that you should play instead, with almost all of them offering a sandbox experience while still presenting players with a proper challenge that is built to be mastered. Almost all of them ask players to stick around after the first playthrough, with most of them offering endgame content to allow for further mastery and even more challenge. These games are challenging, and I would recommend watching gameplay to see which one you like most so you can stick to that one and focus on all the content it has to offer. Start at the highest difficulty where the game feels challenging but not impossible. If you decide to play on a lower difficulty, don't feel too bad about it. Climbing difficulties is one of the most rewarding things you can do in these games, and everyone learns at their own pace, so I would say go ahead and tackle these games at whatever pace you feel is right. These are just my recommendations, and if you don't like them, the least I would ask of you is that you at least play these games. There's so many action games out there that do so many things so much better that it kinda makes it hard for me to care about DMC5 having a good game hidden within it. It ends up making its concept of a good idea a worthless endeavor, especially considering the fact that there really is so many other better options. I wanted to love DMC5, but instead I ended up hating what I had to play through, especially considering the fact that deep inside the core of its soul hides a truly fantastic game. Like I said in the intro, combat isn't all bad. When you consider just the character kits, I would even consider it great. Dante and Nero are extremely in-depth and complex characters, but still carry a unique pick-up-and-play nature that allows for the two to still be easily played. Their complexity doesn't serve to simply make it harder to use the character, but rather allows your time with them to become more rewarding. They're easy to pick up, but spending time to master them is a truly rewarding process. Even at their most basic, Dante and Nero's tools are so flashy that pulling off the most basic strings is still very entertaining. It's not hard to do cool things. Mastery doesn't provide a power fantasy since you're already so strong to begin with. Mastery simply makes you a cut above the rest by providing you an unwieldy addictive power that most won't even be able to use. Doing a combo on an enemy, launching them into the air, comboing them in the air, dropping them to the ground, jumping back into the air, then to grapple the same enemy to continue the combo is a very potent combat rhythm. That level of complexity when it comes to combat cannot exist without the tools being designed to facilitate emergent gameplay, and overall that's something DMC5 does very well. The amount of things you can do in this combat system is vast and varied, with every single player having their own unique traits with the way they handle both Dante and Nero. One of the strongest aspects about the game is how it presents players with two separate combat puzzles. Dante and Nero live under the same roof, but both have their own role. Both play very differently, and both present players with different lessons to learn and puzzles to solve. Nero is clean and to the point, with his moveset being very concise. He has a melee weapon, a ranged weapon, a hook, a grapple, and devil breakers. Prosthetic arms that allow for new moves to be performed when equipped. Each one presents players with a unique array of tools, and does a great job at adding variety to Nero's simple kit. Different players will find themselves sticking to different ones, since they each change the way you engage in combat in such a way that encourages mastery. They aren't so significant to your gameplay that you feel naked without them, but having them in your arsenal does make a difference. Devil Breakers are very easy tools to use, since they really just require a single button press to get any use out of them, making Nero's Mastery much less reliant on said tool. Nero's Mastery comes from the Exceed ability. When you press left trigger, you will rev your sword. After 3 charges, you will get a pip of Exceed, with each pip modifying the effect of your attack. You have 3 pips of Exceed, with each pip presenting a different version of each special attack you have. Nero's launcher will work differently depending on the amount of pips you have, with the third being the most powerful. After an attack, if timed properly, you can cancel into a rev and get Exceed charges, allowing you to follow up or finish up strings of more powerful moves. Each attack has its own unique timing, with the window of execution itself being very tight. If you get the wrong timing, you'll get some Exceed charge, but not a full pip. This one mechanic makes up the bulk of Nero's Mastery, and raises his otherwise simple moveset's skill ceiling much higher than it would be without it. He's a simple character, but in order to get the most out of him, you're going to have to learn the proper Exceed timings, otherwise you're just left with a drastically less impressive character. Dante is all about adaptation. In comparison, the man has so much that it feels like overkill, with Dante serving 4 ranged weapons, melee weapons, and 4 styles. One is a parry, one enhances melee, one enhances range, and the last opens up your movement, giving you a dash and a teleport. Each melee weapon has its own unique collection of unique strings and specials, with each one being a wholly unique tool. The swords are generic all-rounder weapons, presenting a lot of easy combos and gap closers that will work in almost any situation. Balrog is a set of gloves and boots that are highly focused on aggression and ignition charges, a mechanic in which after a set amount of attacks, you'll get a speed boost and a power boost that buff the entire toolset. Cavalry, a set of dual-wielded bikes, specialize in trading out mobility and speed for high-damaging multi-hitting attacks, leaving you open to much more threats compared to almost every other tool, while also offering the most DPS out of any other one. And King Cerberus, nunchucks that wield the power of ice, fire, and lightning to rein the speed and power of each element against their foes. King Cerberus is my favorite of the bunch, especially with how loud Dante ends up getting when he uses it. His ranged weapons aren't as important, so I won't cover them all, but they still serve an equal variety of use cases compared to the melee arsenal. With so many tools, Dante's skill ceiling is the highest in the game and presents a very impressive challenge to master. Mastering Dante requires adaptation. You should be able to constantly switch between weapons and styles without faltering in your execution of said tools in order to get the most out of Dante. Relying on specific tools is absolutely possible considering the difficulty of the game, but if you really want to get the most out of Dante, you have to use everything. Every ranged weapon has at least 3 more options with its accompanying styles, with melee being the same. Dante has a lot of tools, and learning to use whatever you have while still being optimal about your gameplay decisions makes Dante one of the most emergent gameplay experiences in any action game ever. No matter how good the movesets are going to be, the campaign experience is so underwhelming that it ends up dragging the quality of the movesets either way. DMC5 suffers from a severe lack of challenge, with almost every difficulty feeling extremely unbalanced. Normal and hard, Devil Hunter and Son of Sparta both suffer the same balancing issues, with the game's final difficulties suffering completely different issues that are equally as problematic. Devil Hunter is DMC5's normal mode, with its description claiming that it's been built for veterans of action games. This is not correct. Devil Hunter is in fact very easy, so much so that it would probably serve as another game's easy mode if it was put in any other action game. This ends up leaving the first playthrough to become very exhausting due to the fact that it's just so boring. DMC5 doesn't offer a hard mode on new playthroughs, so the balancing problems end up becoming one of the game's biggest issues, especially since every difficulty after suffers from similar problems. DMC5 is a game that presents its players with extremely intricate and complex characters and hopes they'll spend time mastering them, but presents very little content that actually warrants spending all that time. Playing the game as is already feels like overkill, so getting good just ends up leaving the game feeling like a toy. Not only that, but progression also fits the idea that the devs are hoping that players would play well to progress, with the shop and its accompanying systems being designed to fit this role. When you start the campaign, you are given a very limited amount of tools to use, with a lot of the more important moves being locked away in the shop. Combos, movement options, specials, and increased power are all offered in the shop, with most unlockables being extremely integral tools for your damage output and survivability. Getting kills and exploring will earn you red orbs, with higher style rankings giving you more red orbs on kill. At the end of each mission, you are given a rank, with S rank netting you a large bundle of red orbs as a reward for your performance. Mission-wide and encounter-based performance is heavily encouraged, with these systems incentivizing players to play well so that they can get the essential upgrades as quickly as possible. Progression does a great job at incentivizing players to play well, since they are rewarded with a much faster progression curve. The game locks away some pretty essential upgrades, so being able to quickly pile up your arsenal is a great incentive for performance. Your characters feel limited, and the shop basically flaunts that in your face. A similar system to God of War, since in that game going for high combos nets you XP, which you desperately need even from the beginning. Your moveset is limited enough that players get the sense that they're going to need more tools to fend off such a strong opposition. On hard, God of War's enemies are extremely aggressive and highly damaging, so getting any leg up on them is an immediate win. Fighting the basic fodder enemies in the game is already stress-inducing without upgrades, so once the game actually starts to introduce proper threats, the idea of needing upgrades becomes way stronger. It's a great way to get players to perform well, especially considering all the dynamic plays you can accomplish in these games. DMC5's going for the same thing, which is a wonderful thing, and its emphasis on the style meter is a great way at making this iconic mechanic feel more than just set dressing. However, unlike the God of War games, DMC5 does a terrible job at forcing players to engage with the system. With the way the game is laid out, progression really only plays a role in players' first playthroughs of the game, so Devil Hunter making players feel so strong ends up leaving the progression to become worthless. You start out with so little at the beginning, but still nonetheless end up feeling extremely strong compared to what you're facing against. Enemy AI is very non-aggressive and ends up feeling more like sandbags than they do enemy. This is an issue the entire fodder enemy roster has, which wouldn't be so bad if the heavy enemies were better, but they aren't, and in some cases they're just as bad. Heavy units have a lot more moves, but still suffer from the same low damage and low aggression just like everyone else. Even in Son of Sparta, damage and aggression is still an issue, with most threats presenting little to no respect from the player. In God of War, the basic fodder on their own were a serious threat. Their aggression and damage were nothing to laugh at, with low awareness players finding themselves dead much faster than they can begin to realize just how dangerous they ended up being. They also carry strength in numbers, making their already great aggression and damage even that much more of a serious matter. When you knock them down, they have a chance to spin off the ground towards Kratos, dealing massive damage and a light stun. All of DMC5's enemies lack this level of forced respect, since they all really just stand around and really just wait for the player to start wailing on them. It feels like this has been done to attempt to present players with a power fantasy, but it ends up just feeling like you're being treated like a kid. The idea of forcing your players to engage with all your systems is something that DMC5 feels is far too much to ask of players. I think that's terrible, since the best action games allow for that type of gameplay experience while still offering a challenging experience. Enemy units are too brain dead and heavy units too spongy, so you're just left with a trail mix of an enemy roster, with the trail mix being mostly made up of raisins. Once you've beaten the game on Devil Hunter, you will unlock Son of Sparta, which serves as the game's hard mode. In my experience with action games that offer unlockable difficulties, usually they allow you to start a new game with said difficulties. Bayonetta 1 allows its players who will be in the campaign to start a fresh playthrough on whatever unlockable difficulties they have. This retains the progression systems that are in the game, allowing progression and power to still exist, especially considering the fact that the higher difficulties are designed to be treated as a new game plus. The higher difficulties are designed around you having your toolkit, with later difficulties being the most upfront about this. Instead of restricting how players can engage with the content, Bayonetta gives players options. You can either participate in the design experience of a new game plus, where you have all your unlocked tools from the beginning but are challenged with that in mind, or start completely fresh and feel the pressure of not having any of those things while dealing with a force that has been designed to facilitate that experience. The example that is closest to what DMC5 seems to be going for is the Wonderful 101. The game offers players 3 difficulty options in the beginning: very easy, easy, and normal. Similar to Bayonetta, when you beat the game on normal, you unlock hard. Unlike Bayonetta, you can only play this on a save that has cleared the game on normal already. This is due to the fact that hard has been completely built as a new game plus, featuring enemies that cannot be taken on without specific upgrades in your arsenal. Bayonetta's hard mode is designed to be both a new challenge for fresh runs and a further challenge for already completed runs, with the game offering even more challenging difficulties past that. Wonderful 101's hard mode is exclusively a new game plus feature, which is perfect since the game already serves a perfect amount of challenge on normal. DMC5's Son of Sparta mode feels like it was designed similarly to Bayonetta's hard, but is restricted in the same way Wonderful 101 restricts its hard mode. You cannot make new saves in DMC5, an issue so baffling that I cannot believe it made it to the released version of the game. This makes 2 issues present, the worst one being that you cannot start a fresh save with Son of Sparta, even though it feels like the game mode was built as a hard mode for new playthroughs, and the other being the fact that you can't even start any new games at all. How DMC5 gets away with an issue that has never prevailed in any other action game I've encountered is beyond me, especially since it's one of the main issues for most of my critiques on the difficulty. If you can start the game on Son of Sparta, I would still have a lot of negative to say, but it would still be much better than what we have now. It isn't as great as I would like, especially considering its lack of difficulty in the first half, but with the limited tools you have when you start the game, I don't think there would be much of an issue there. So far, things haven't been so great, but I think the one mechanic that really pushes things over the edge from bad to worse is the revive mechanic. When you run out of health, you will be given either the option to revive with red orbs or gold orbs. With red orbs, you are offered 3 different options, with different prices offering different health and devil trigger bar amounts when you come back. The lower the cost, the lower the health and devil trigger you come back with. Of course, since this is a revive, any damage you have inflicted to enemies will still be there, meaning that if you get a boss to half health and die, then revive with full health, that boss is still going to be at half health. In a game that is already so easy, this system turns Devil Hunter from a cakewalk to a couch nap. Whenever you come across a force that slightly opposes you in any way and die, you can just revive. The cost of revives are so low that not reviving is the worst option you can make. There could have been an interesting decision-making factor here if the game was harder. If the bosses were so hard that you felt you needed to revive at the cost of some potential upgrades, that would lead to an interesting decision-making process. The problem is the game isn't hard, so this just ends up making the already easy game feel like a play toy. A gold orb is a currency that is exclusive to this mechanic, with the game throwing a bunch at the player throughout their first playthrough. Unlike red orbs, gold orbs only have one choice in revive, that being full everything. When you come back with the gold orb, you get full health and full devil trigger, making the potential decision-making process of sacrificing your precious red orbs for another chance at the fight no longer even a concept we can consider. Dante Must Die offers this decision in some ways, but by then you have everything unlocked, so it becomes a no-brainer to revive no matter what. Revives are drastically more expensive, but getting a lot of red orbs is far too easy for that to be an issue. This makes Devil Hunter worthless, but also ends up cheapening the value of any other difficulty as well. Of course, you can just not revive, which makes the game feel drastically better. The problem is the fact that the system is a core mechanic of the game. Even when you choose not to engage with it, the existence of it will always linger, and the temptation of it can easily get to you. It invalidated any value that the combat may have had simply by existing. Yes, you can play the game without using it, and if you end up doing that, don't use it past Devil Hunter. But its existence makes it feel like the devs weren't even respecting what they were making. One trait that almost all the best action games share is confidence. Sifu, Doom Eternal, and Ninja Gaiden all uphold their mission of presenting players with a challenge to master without leaving out those who just want to push buttons and have a fun time. Sifu has easy, normal, and hard, with the game having modifiers to make the game even more challenging or more easy depending on how you want to tackle things. Doom Eternal has 5 difficulties, with the last 2 being a true test of mastery of the campaign. That's not even including all the extra hardcore content in the game, which all still present that same 5 difficulty ladder. Ninja Gaiden is probably the one exception, with the game not really being anywhere near as lenient, but still serves players in easy mode. Mode that feels like an introduction and less like an easy mode, but nonetheless is still an accessible way to approach the game. DMC5 tries to do a similar thing by having 4 unlockable difficulties after Devil Hunter, but the worthless stature of the mode, lack of new saves alongside the revive mechanic leads the potentially fantastic combat into nothing more than a concept of what could have been. Real quick, I want to mention Dante Must Die, and its insignificance in the discussion. Dante Must Die has the same enemy placement and enemy aggression from Son of Sparta, that adds the abilities for enemies to activate Devil Trigger. Dante Must Die universally decreases players' damage to 50%, while increasing enemy damage to 300%. Enemies with Devil Trigger, however, decrease player damage to 25%, and increase the damage they deal to players to 600%. I believe that any difficulty mode that simply drops player damage and increases enemy damage immediately becomes worthless. Dante Must Die is a worthless mode, and is the worst version of DMC5 you could be playing. The interesting ideas that the mode springs up immediately die out with the mode's abysmal balancing. Even in the end, DMC5 still finds ways to suffer from the exact same issue. One thing that action games always get critiques on is their level design, with most action games struggling to make interesting levels. Sifu uses enemy encounters and visuals to really carry its level design, with the game being extremely linear. Since encounter design and art are just so strong, this never becomes an issue, especially considering just how condensed the game really is, while still being able to get long hour counts out of its first time players. The game is short enough that it's able to get away with having such a linear feel, especially when combat is so intoxicating. Similar to Sifu, Resident Evil 4 also places a pretty big emphasis on its encounters and art, but its most impressive feat in breaking the tedium of combat is treasure hunting. Exploring areas and hallways to find high-value loot so that you can upgrade your arsenal to deal with the menacing force you're faced with is a fantastic routine, and helps the game's pacing immensely. Combat can become so overwhelming that having large spans of gameplay where you're simply running around looking for items become an equally engaging task to combat. Treasure hunting is equally as engaging, but is nowhere near as exhausting, which makes it one of the best gameplay loops for any action game. Sulaco uses exploration to pace out its combat by rewarding its players with essential upgrades. The enemies in Sulaco are constantly being given more tools throughout the game, with a default soldier already being a threatening force. Exploration alleviates the power balance between player and AI, since you're given a lot of power if you engage with the exploration. The art also helps, with the mandatory arena spaces not even feeling like arenas. The game feels like a real world, and it helps alleviate the repetition that comes from the combat. Sulaco uses art, arena design, and exploration to pace out its action. Action games have come to terms with the fact that they must have pace breakers to lean onto that don't involve combat, with the best pace breakers leading back into the combat in interesting ways. Having a campaign that is exclusively combat is exhausting. Action games put so much mental strain on players that in some ways you are forced into having pace breakers in your game. A game like Sifu is so condensed that it can get away with it, but most action games aren't as small as that. Most action game campaigns are around 10 hours long, which can be extremely exhausting by the end if you have nothing else to serve besides combat. DMC5, unlike most action games, has no pace breakers. DMC5 is very repetitive. Levels consist of arenas and hallways, with almost every single level feeling the exact same. Very little is done to spice up the way it feels to traverse throughout the game, and whatever variety does exist is so underdeveloped that I would be putting more effort into bringing it up than the devs did making it. Spawning into a hallway to walk into arenas to then walk into another just to repeat until you make it to the boss is DMC5's only design philosophy. This is bad for two reasons. The first being that the design template is outright bad. Games that do take this template do a lot to make the idea of walking through hallway into arena repeat feel less tedious. Doom Eternal was historically blasted for this design, even though I believe that game handled it pretty well. Platforming, gimmick enemy encounters, and art played a major role in making that game always feel fresh. It also helps that the game throws so many new things at you for almost the entire campaign that repetition can almost feel non-existent at times. Since DMC5's combat is so lackluster, traversing levels and the tedium it produces only furthers the issue. The second reason for the game's reliance on the design being bad is that it produces a lack of variety. Almost every game has a core understanding that variety and giving players new things to look at, use, or shoot is a great way to alleviate tedium. Enemies, art, weapons, and upgrades can all go great lengths to reduce repetition, with level design probably being the most important on the list. DMC5 has no variety in its levels. Even when you switch characters, an act that should clearly define change in the game, it still ends up feeling the same and just produces the same type of repetition. The art in DMC5 is amazing in one specific way: consistency. Level and enemy art is so consistent in style that it's genuinely impressive. DMC5 being able to pull off a consistent art style that feels natural for both enemies and levels is a feat that should be cheered on. However, the art itself does nothing more than further this issue of tedium, with most levels and enemies looking extremely alike. The game has two settings, city and tentacle layer, and never deviates from that. The colors and visuals are so consistent that even when you're objectively in a different space, you can't shake the feeling that you've been here before. A feeling that only adds on to that I've already done this nature of the combat. Doom 2016 is a game with the exact same issue. The gameplay does a great job at encouraging players to stick to the tools they're comfortable in, so repetition from the gameplay is almost guaranteed. Hell and UAC facilities are Doom's settings, with the game never deviating from that. Even when you're in a space that you've objectively never been in, you can't shake the feeling that you've been there before. A feeling which makes the I've already done this feeling you get from the gameplay lead to a heightened sense of repetition. Doom Eternal definitely suffers from the simple level design, but its combat, arena design, and platforming does just enough to completely kill off that repetition. DMC5 has very little variety in either its combat or arena design, so the level design being visually basic while being extremely linear leaves things feeling very repetitive, leaving the last half of the game feeling twice the length. Let's do a quick overview. DMC5's gameplay is compromised due to a lack of challenge and options, making the game's superb progression completely pointless. The revive system makes challenge non-existent for most of the game. It's a system that could present an interesting gameplay decision but ends up being so easy that there ends up only being one decision to be made. The simple inclusion of the mechanic invalidates a lot of the quality that the campaign had to begin with. Level design is far too linear, with the game's complete emphasis on just the combat leading to a long, boring campaign. The art style is great, but since it's so consistent, it tends to add repetition, with levels not being able to have their own distinct styles. There is one last thing. Where all these things in combinations bring the game down substantially, I don't think any individual aspect is as bad as V. V is a puppet character archetype with his gameplay revolving around controlling creatures that fight for him. He has a lion and a bird, with the lion covering CQC and the bird focusing on range damage. Both have unique moves just like any other character, with V simply commanding them to execute said move. V doesn't do much other than just finish off enemies once they've reached 0 health. The creatures do all the fighting, and this leads to drastically different gameplay styles. V focuses a lot more on managing your placement and double trigger charge management than he does execution. In an RTS, the act of getting your troops to do things is a simple click away. Want someone to move? Push a button. Need them to shoot? Push a button. Need them to retreat? It's a button press away. The skill doesn't come from the execution, but rather the management of the factors within the game. What troops do you have, what is in construction, and what objective should you prioritize? Surprisingly enough, V plays pretty close to an RTS, a very interesting shift from the in-your-face nature of both Dante and Nero. However, V's execution is so bad that it ruins almost all the content involving him in terms of gameplay. V is very good at staying away from enemies while still being able to dish out damage. The most word you're going to get when it comes to staying alive is whether or not you're just close enough to allow your pets to attack from far away. The creatures can only attack certain enemies that are at a specific distance from you. If your griffin's able to shoot ranged projectiles at a faraway enemy and you wish to do a special, and the enemy's too far away, the special will simply be activated wherever V ends up at. This seems like a smart way to get players to stay close and make them feel threatened, but the range it has set is already so far that it ends up just making the character feel drastically worse. A big issue with V is that he just doesn't feel good. When I said you command your creatures, I specifically meant just that. V doesn't have much power over the creatures, with attack commands being the most you can do to control them. Your side sweep and double jump can give you some control, but in combat these tools are almost pointless. They're only useful when you find yourself in an elevated space, requiring that they come to you at a faster rate than they are allowed. Trying to engage enemies with your creatures at a distance just to have them not show up for large spans of time is a very common issue. This should never happen, and if it can, it should be limited as much as possible. The creatures are V's only means of damage, meaning that if you don't have your creatures with you, you just can't do anything. This should lead players to play defensive, but V's missions are still no exception to the balance issues that already exist, meaning that you aren't left threatened but frustrated, since you just have to sit there and wait before you can do anything. V is easy mode, so much so that the rest of the game ends up looking like a challenging experience in comparison. V's gameplay consists of button mashing, since you can't perform anything more than basic commands for your pets. There is no skill curve with V, just a limit to what you can do with more unlocks. When V is in combat, he could pull out a book to read and charge up his Devil Trigger. V can use Devil Trigger pips to power up his creatures, allowing them to spam specials while giving them a boost in health and damage. Meaning that from a distance you can harass enemies, power up both creatures, charge up Devil Trigger, and spam power-ups whenever you run out, since the amount you'll get from hitting creatures and reading the book is so high that you can basically sustain infinite Devil Trigger. When your creatures die, they become these orbs, making them unable to do anything. Over time, they'll regenerate their life bar, where they'll then respawn. If you stand close to these orbs, you can further increase the speed of their recovery. However, if you activate Devil Trigger instead, it will immediately respawn both creatures and spawn in the Nightmare. V is the only character in any action game that is almost completely void of any danger at all times due to his kit's design and the game's balancing. V isn't remotely fun or engaging in any way, and actively makes his portions of the game into a getting over it situation where you play as quickly as possible to finish those levels so you can go back to the good characters. With all the issues Dante and Nero's missions have already, V's missions only serve to make that experience of playing the game even more boring and annoying. V makes up a quarter of the campaign, with that entire quarter being some of the most boring in any game I've ever had to play, actively making replays of the game worse. DMC5's campaign gives 3 characters with their own unique missions. For the most part, Nero's missions can only be played by Nero, with only a mission or 2 giving players the option to choose which character they want. That means that on all difficulties and on any replay, you will always have to play V's missions. V is a terrible addition to the game. When the challenge finally kicks in during Son of Sparta, you have to worry about V's missions since they never get harder. They just get longer. For some reason, the designers expanded V's arenas to be more dense and challenging, with V presenting an equal amount of enemy density and variety that comes with the later difficulties. Since his kit by default is so broken, this does nothing, leading to his encounters being drastically longer on the higher difficulties, making it even more unbearable. I think the best thing about DMC5 is its existence. Aside from indies, the amount of action games we've gotten since 2019 is almost non-existent, with companies understanding that there really isn't a huge demand for these types of games. DMC5 looking as good as it is and being as optimized as it is should be celebrated. A game of this caliber existing at all is a miracle. with other action games requiring they be pitched as different things in order to get the green light. Doom Eternal is a major example I can think of when it comes to AAA action games, with that game being considered a shooter more than an action game. DMC5 was greenlit with the knowledge that it would be an action game, and the fact that there are still people out there willing to put out games like this is something to be championed. However, DMC5's issues should not be ignored and should be lambasted. DMC5 at almost every turn chooses to ignore lessons learned from its peers. DMC5 is not a good game. In a lot of ways, it's not even close to being mediocre. It's just outright bad. So much of it is compromised to such a high degree that it makes me wonder why anyone would play this game over any other action game on the market. Its level design is swatted by Sulaco, and its emphasis on exploration to further the combat. Its combat is atomized by the flowing gameplay of Sifu with its focus on adaptation and finding a flow to truly succeed in combat. Then there's V, who brings the whole game down so much that I find myself constantly questioning how I even got through the game. Devil May Cry 5 is a bad game.